So I guess the first question I had is obviously you've really emphasized how central, humor was to Lincoln's leadership. So I guess I was wondering, why do you think why he relied so much on humor to, connect with people, to, navigate crises and also manage stress,
Sure.
obviously. Yeah.
Sure. Well, as you say, yes, managed stress, and that's one aspect of Lincoln's humor. Of course, is the other side of the coin
uh,
of his depression, his known
Right.
depression. But I think humor was absolutely central to his being from childhood. He made the other children laugh when he got up on the log after the revivalist preachers had been in town, and he would mimic them. He would utter a prayer asking God to put socks on the chickens so they didn't get too cold in winter. Um, and from that time onwards, and his father, of course, was also a great humorist. So he learnt about humor from his father. But I think it was absolutely natural to his being. And what he learns along the way between childhood and running for the White House in 1860 is that there are certain limits to how you should use humor in public life. Um, and he learns, for example, that you should avoid cruelty and sarcasm in humor. He tried it once, more than once, when he was a young politician. And he had the crowd in fits of hysteria as he mimicked Judge Thomas. He'd got his tone of voice, he's got his mannerisms, he's got his way of walking. And it ended up with Judge Thomas, who was present, absolutely blubbing like a baby. He was so humiliated. And Lincoln was aware of his power, but he realized that actually this was not good for either his image or actually it was not natural to him. He actually wasn't a cruel man.
Right.
So he didn't use cruelty in the future. And then he also recognized that when subjects are really serious, we look at the way in which in the 1850s he was running against Douglas in 1858 for Senate. His speeches during the 1850s dealing with slavery and the possible expansion of slavery and the ethical issues connected with race, um, these are too serious to be the subject of humor. It doesn't mean to say that he's not humorous off stage, but in politics, as he's running for office in 1858 and again in 1860, his speeches are extremely serious. And of course, what we know of him through the Civil War is the great speeches are the Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural and his address to Congress in July of 1861. These are serious speeches. They are not peppered with jokes. But he does know the importance of humor in both in terms of his own mental buoyancy. He says to Francis Carpenter, the painter who comes into the White House in 1864 to do a painting of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, he says, um, humor is the vent of my moods and glooms. Without humor, I would not be able to survive. He says, I don't take alcohol, but I do find in humor and in jokes the equivalent of a stiff drink. It gives me life. So there's that sort of dimension to it. So it's hugely important to him. But secondly, and I think this is extremely important, uh, knowing how to use humor is a means of power and control.
Right.
Power and control. And he uses that humor very deliberately in a whole range of settings. It comes naturally to him.
Right.
It's not, sometimes he's just naturally witty. So, for example, when it's pointed out to him uh, that the Attorney General um, uh, Edward Bates has got grey hair and a black beard. He said, "Well, that's natural. He doesn't use his brain very much, but he uses his jaw an awful lot." Uh, so, but that comes straight from the sort of witty side of him. But more often than not, he just uses his great stock of stories. I mean, his father has told him stories. He's got access to Joe Miller's jests, Quinn's jests. He picks up these stories on the circuit when he's a lawyer in the 1840s and 1850s. They spend their evenings in the taverns as the the defendant, the attorneys, and as the judges on the court. Um, they spend their evenings just swapping tales. And Lincoln has this extraordinary memory, this capacity to retain the stories that he hears. And there's, in addition, what is equally important, the capacity to use them appropriately and aptly, appositely in any given setting. So that uh, what comes across when people listen to Lincoln are a number of things. One is that he's utterly relatable. He's a common man. His stories are the stories of the prairie, the backwoods, the story of the barnyard, the story that is populated with domestic animals, with wild animals, with drunks, with the kind of eccentrics of the community, populated by stories of the preacher or of the congregation. Uh, he relates to people. He can relate about people, and ordinary people can see in Lincoln that here is someone who is on their wavelength, who understands them and who speaks to their condition. So he's the kind of relatable common man. Um, he also has this capacity to use stories as, well, I think two ways. Two ways I want to highlight particularly. One is self-deprecation.
Right.
I think the most successful politicians are those who can be self-deprecating when they use humor. The best target for humor is oneself. So there are a load of stories I could tell you about Lincoln self-deprecating. I won't do more than mention one, but he tells the story about he's splitting rails. He's got an axe in his hand and he's chopping up wood. And he looks up, but he sees himself staring into the barrel of a gun. And he sees someone he's never seen before. It's a passerby. And the passerby says that he's promised to shoot the first man that he meets who is uglier than himself. So Lincoln takes a good look at the man's face and says, well, okay, bares his chest and says, if I am uglier than you, then just blaze away. you know, so I mean, Lincoln wasn't really an ugly man. He was physically peculiar. He had very long arms. He had very long top half of his body. Um, but he played on this sense of his physical peculiarity. He can side with the underdog. Of course, you can only work in this way, self-deprecatingly, if you've got a tremendous sense of self-worth, if you actually are very happy in your own skin. Lincoln was entirely happy in his own skin, so he could tell these stories against himself without in any way undermining his own self-confidence, and by building up a confidence in others that here was a man who was not too grand for them. But Lincoln would also use stories. I mean, did you want to ask another question, or
Oh
are
no,
you
sure,
happy?
no,
Are you
no,
happy for
no.
me to carry on?
Keep
Happy to
going. Yeah,
carry on?
sure, sure,
Carry on. Yeah, sure.
sure.
So then he uses stories for diversion. Um, that the wonderful thing for any politician is to have a means of deflecting
Yeah,
conversations that you don't like. So there's Lincoln in 1864. And the question is, will he run for president a second time? Will he be a two-term president? And will he run the second time? And he doesn't want to answer that question. So he says, well, he tells the story of the itinerant preacher, this quack preacher who comes to Springfield, Illinois, and asks for permission to use the Springfield State House to deliver his address. And the Illinois state auditor, who has control of the premises, says, "Well, what's the address about?" And the preacher said, "Well, it's about the second coming of Christ." "Ah," says the official, "that's absolute nonsense. If Christ had been to Springfield once, he would certainly be damn sure not to come again." Uh, well, so by the time he's told this punchline, he's got the man out of the door. He's not talking about his own second coming as president.
right.
Or just one other story which I very much like, and this is totally authenticated. After he's been elected and he enters the White House and he just in his first month as president, he's bombarded with office seekers, people who want jobs. And some people come in on behalf of a man who say this absolutely perfect for the post of commissioner to the Sandwich Islands. Sandwich Islands, of course, Hawaii. And the balmy climate, the man is unwell, and the balmy climate of the Sandwich Islands would be the perfect means of restoring him to health. Well, Lincoln says, he says, "I'm really sorry to hear about your guy. Um, the problem is, I've got 8 other applicants for that post, and they're all sicker than your man." So, but again, he gets the joke, he gets the humor. He does it because it's absolutely intrinsic to him. It's part of his humanity. It makes him what he is, really. There's nothing artificial about it.
Yeah,
It's absolutely his core.
right.
Um,
Very natural, as
uh,
you mentioned. Yeah,
it's absolutely natural. Yeah,
yeah. During the war itself, how did it kind of allow him to, build trust with people in a way? Like one example that I've kind of read about is that at pretty sure it was the Battle of Antietam.
yeah, yeah,
And he was visiting like a bunch of soldiers, and they were kind of very sick. They had fallen, and he
yeah,
kind of cracked jokes, and that sort of made him a lot more approachable. Like, can you maybe talk about
yeah.
that example?
Yeah, that's true. That he can use wit in a whole and humor in a variety of settings, particularly in a kind of battlefield or a hospital setting. Um, for example, he's in a hospital, a field hospital, and there is a soldier who is incapacitated and in bed and is being visited by a young woman, uh, a philanthropic young woman, tender age. And she says to him, he's in bed because he has been shot through the testicles. And she says to the soldier, "Where were you shot?" And the soldier is kind of embarrassed. He says, "Well, I was shot in Antietam." And she says, "No, but where were you shot?" And Lincoln has a quiet word with the soldier and discovers the truth. And he then turns to the young woman and says, "Well, madam, yes, the soldier appreciates your inquiry. I can tell you that the bullet that hit him would have missed you."
Right. Uh,
And you
yeah,
get the story.
right,
The problem is that it can sometimes be turned against Lincoln.
right,
You mentioned the Battle of Antietam. I've just done so. During 1864, when Lincoln is indeed running for re-election, the Democrats start using the picture of Lincoln as a smutty joker,
right.
as a man who is unable to be serious, even in the most appalling of circumstances. And they relate the story of how Lincoln at Antietam, shortly after the battle, when the bodies of the soldiers are still warm, he crosses the battlefield in an ambulance, a horse-drawn ambulance, with Marshal Lamon and with General McClellan. And the story goes, as the Democrats tell it, that he taps Lamon on the knee and says, "Come on, Lamon, sing us that song about Picayune Butler." That's a kind of funny song. And McClellan is by the story appalled that Lincoln should be wanting to lighten the mood. The story was completely false. There was an episode, a similar kind of episode, but it happened weeks later, and it was not related to the dead on the battlefield. But Lincoln was vulnerable because his association with the front and his association with humor could be turned against him. So it's a balancing act that he has to maintain, really.
Right. Did he also kind of use it to sort of like diffuse tensions during the war? Like there are a few examples that I've read about, which is one was during the Trent Affair crisis. There was
Yes.
obviously one way he kind of tried to ease tensions and sort of ease the situation where he like joked about something to do with a like a man in a church with a preach or something and being a hopeless minority. Like,
Well,
does that ring a
that's
bell?
right. That's a great
Right.
story. You know that? Do you want me to
Yeah,
tell
yeah,
that? Tell you that
yeah, yeah.
story? Well,
Sure. Yeah, yeah.
well, of course, Lincoln had a wonderful range of stories about ministers and about preachers and congregations, and he tells the story. It's another one of his stories where there's a drunk involved, and there's a kind of the drunk is sitting snoring in the front pew of the church when the minister asks the congregation, who are going to be saved? Who are going to be saved? And they all stand as one. and, and he says now, and who are going to go to hell? At this point, the drunk wakes up and looks around and sees, he isn't quite certain what's going on, but he sees the preacher standing in the front. So he stands up and he says, well, preacher, I don't quite understand the question, but I think I can say, you and I got to stand together in this, and we're both going where you want us to go. So that's the kind of story. And at which point Lincoln says, I'm in a minority of one in the
Right,
cabinet on this, but I'm going to go my own way. So
right,
that's the kind of story.
right,
He uses these stories to make a very powerful point. He always said that the thing about you telling stories, well, they were sort of parables. They were colorful stories that were much more effective in making his point than simply setting out a kind of dry argument.
right. I've also heard that kind of Lincoln was maybe notoriously known to also use more like dirty bathroom humor in a way. Like,
Yeah,
does that point
yeah.
have any validity
Oh,
to
yeah.
it too? Like, did he also
Yes,
do that a little bit?
yeah. He certainly did. And close associates were really worried that if the public knew just how many of these sort of vulgar stories, these dirty stories, these off-color stories that Lincoln was telling, that it would do him no favors.
Mm.
Indeed, in the 1864 campaign, the New York Herald, the editor of the New York Herald, James Gordon Bennett, ran an editorial when the Republicans were looking for a candidate, in which he was pressing the claims of John C. Fremont. And after every statement about Fremont, every single sentence about Fremont, he then put another sentence saying, Fremont is not a smutty joker. He didn't have to use Lincoln's name, but it was known that Lincoln was a smutty joker. And Lincoln himself once said, he was asked why he didn't put down all of his stories in a book. And Lincoln said, well, if I were to do that, I'm afraid my book would just stink like 1,000 privies. Uh, there's a cache of Lincoln's supposedly off-color, I mean, that's the term that is often used, vulgar stories in the Newberry Library in Chicago, which were only opened to public view decades after Lincoln's death. And the story is that John Pope had telegraphed Washington to say that he'd captured 5,000 of Beauregard's men and was now marching on the Confederates, and he would soon have the Confederates in his power. And the cabinet asked Lincoln what to make of the claim. Well, said Lincoln, that reminds me of an old woman in Sangamon County who was ill. And the doctor came and prescribed some medicine for her. She had constipation. So he returned the following morning and then found, after she'd taken this medicine, that she was fresh and well and getting breakfast. So he, seeing that the medicine had worked, he said, did she feel better? Yes, 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 it had. She felt better. So he said, well, how many bowel movements have you had? 142. No, madam, no, madam, no. I'm serious. I know you're joking. How many? Well, 142. Madam, I know you couldn't have had 142. I mean, it's absolutely necessary that I know the exact number of movements that you had. Well, I tell you, she said, 142. 140 of them were wind. So it's a kind of fart joke, really.
Yeah, yeah, that's
Uh,
good.
yeah. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing. I think by modern standards, it has to be said, these off-color jokes are um, uh, pretty tame,
Right.
but and they were not full of bad language, but they were generally to do with sort of bodily functions. Yeah,
Today, there are many leaders that use humor today. One figure that really comes to mind is someone like Donald Trump. I feel like he's
yeah,
known to kind of use that, like bully humor in a way. Also,
yeah,
Ronald Reagan was also famous to use it.
yes,
Someone like Vladimir Zelensky also now. I know he was actually
yes.
previously a stand-up comedian. So I guess my question is, how do you think their styles of humor kind of compare to what Lincoln did and kind of the way that they use it in their lives and to be effective as a leader?
Yeah, well, I think I mean Reagan is. I did a broadcast for a comedy store in Washington a few years ago when they were looking at the humor of presidents, and in the end, it was a runoff between Lincoln and Reagan.
Uh,
Uh, and we talked about the host, who is in fact a stand-up comedian, and I talked about their different styles of humor. I think Reagan was a narrative, and he was a vaudevillian, basically. He was very good timing and very good at sort of narrative stories.
right.
Um, and certainly was very funny, and he could puncture a mood very easily. But what he didn't have, what I think Lincoln had, was the capacity to apply the humor in a specific way. I think I'll give you some examples of how Lincoln uses his stories in a very particular setting to make a point. Whereas I think Reagan was extremely funny, but it wasn't necessarily in pursuit of a specific political policy or a political moment. It was more just a kind of feel good um, capacity for feel good humor. I think Donald Trump's humor is kind of
Yeah,
bullying humor.
definitely.
Uh, I mean, I there's no self-deprecation in
Not at all, really. Yeah,
there's
not at
just
all.
absolutely no. Uh, I take there's the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr wrote about humor and how he argued that rightly or wrongly, you can sort of reflect on this, that great statesmen had to have a sense of humor because uh, what a sense of humor does is to make you recognize human foibles,
Right.
that there is no such thing as human perfection,
Right.
that we all make mistakes. And the point about the sense of humor is that you see the foibles not only of others but of yourself. I think Lincoln ticks those boxes.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
You also mentioned earlier how throughout his life, Lincoln was known to experience a lot of sadness, a lot of depression. So do you
Yes.
think that humor, in a way, was kind of more of a coping mechanism, or was it kind of more of what you were mentioning before, that kind of strategic communication tool, or is it both? Like, which one do you think
I
is?
think it's both. I think
Right.
it's both. I think it's absolutely intrinsic to him. He
Right.
said himself, he was quite explicit that if it were not for the resort to stories and to jokes and to humor, um, he would not cope.
Right.
These were, as he put it, the vents to his moods and his gloom. But he also was quite calculating in his use of humor. He could see exactly how strategically to use it. Um, and as I've given you some examples of how sometimes the wit comes out
Yeah.
in the moment. Like when I said that um, to those people who wanted their man to be set off to get the job in the Sandwich Islands, well, he immediately says, "Well, they're all sicker than your man. The other eight are all sicker than your man." That's absolutely in the moment. It's not a calculated story to be told. But other times he will begin saying, "Well, that reminds me of a story." And of course, that phrase, "that reminds me of a story," is one that reminds me of a little story, is one that was recognized as Lincoln's way of introducing something that would be to the point, but also a kind of deflection or a diversion from the point.
Right.
So I think your question is a very good one. I think both are true. I don't think there was anything artificial about
Right.
Lincoln's humor. and Lincoln's sense of humor. It was absolutely ingrained. It was part of his humanity. Um, and I don't think he would have been the leader he was. And he was a great leader. I don't think he would have been the leader he was without that
Mm.
capacity to laugh at himself and to laugh at others. He often said, that here I am, I'm the least quarrelsome person. I mean, I've never wanted to quarrel. Uh, and here am I leading the nation in this struggle, when which, over time, 750,000 died um, as a result of a political quarrel over the nature of the Union. Um, in that setting, uh, humor was essential to his well-being. But it was also, as I say, an instrument, a valuable political instrument.
Yeah. You were mentioning earlier that point of him being self-deprecating, and like one one I guess famous one famous example that I know is I think it was like during one of the debates with his opponent. It was like Stephen Douglas, and he Stephen said that he was like two-faced, and then he replied by saying,
Yeah,
"If
yeah,
I was,
sure.
why would I be using
Why would
this
I?
face?" Or yeah, something
That's
like that.
basic.
Yeah, so
Exactly.
that's I feel like a
Yeah,
very famous example of him
sure.
being
Yeah.
self-deprecating and
Yes,
uh,
exactly. And I won't say that the debates with Douglas were completely void of humor, but they were largely void of humor. He tells the story of the wife who is watching a bear attacking her husband. And she's on the sidelines clapping and cheering and saying, "Go it, husband, go it, bear." He uses that to point to the clash between Douglas and his political opponents within the Democratic Party, the Buchanan supporters. So it's so he's able to say, without reference specifics to the story, he just simply says for the audience, "Go it, husband, go it, bear," and they know exactly what he's getting at, and they laugh.
yeah, right,
Uh, yeah,
yeah. Obviously today politics is very heated, very polarizing, and I feel like humor can definitely be very risky nowadays. And
yeah,
you were mentioning some of the
yes,
backlash that Lincoln faced. So I guess like my question is, what do you think contemporary leaders can learn from the very strategic way that Lincoln used humor when trying to employ it now? Like maybe like young politicians, young comedians trying to make
yeah.
points, trying to delve into you know political issues.
I think that's a very, very good question, and what you're really saying is uh, the country just too divided and uh, uh, wrought up to be able to find humor in a politician acceptable. Um, my own feeling is that actually it's an enormously powerful weapon,
Yeah,
particularly when used in a self-deprecating way. Who am I to give instructions to American politicians, Democrats or Republicans? It's very because this is such an over-earnest milieu now. The intensity, the earnestness, and the heart, the anger that is
yeah,
so rife in American politics. But I do think that being able to lift to challenge that mood with some self-deprecating humor, not jokes at the expense of your opponents, but perhaps jokes at your own expense,
yeah,
might actually serve to humanize the individual politician, to show that that person has got the capacity for a kind of more rounded view of the world and of humankind. I think that would be what I'd very much like to see,
yeah,
because I think it could be quite a telling weapon.
yeah. I guess to kind of end here, like, um, if you have like one favorite Lincoln story that you think really exemplifies some of the things we've been talking about today, I don't know if you want to share it or.
Um, yeah, okay. Well, I think it's another preacher story, but the preacher who says, "The Bible tells us of one perfect man, Jesus Christ, but it doesn't tell us of one perfect woman." At which point, there's a voice from the back of the congregation saying, "I know of a perfect woman." "Oh, yes," says the preacher. "Yes," says this plaintive female voice. "Yes, My husband's first wife. I have heard about her every day for the last 6 years.
That's
Okay.
good. That's good.
So the perfect woman. Yeah. Okay. I was,
All right, yeah.
yeah. Okay.
And thank you so
Okay.
much again. Yeah, you gave
I
really
suppose if you want, there's another one. I just sort of thought he
sure, yeah,
uh,
sure.
uh I mean one of we haven't talked about Lincoln was a logician. He read the books of Euclid. He self-taught as a logician. He read the books of Euclid, and you can see that in his speeches of the 1850s. And so he quite liked stories that were about sort of misapplied logic.
Mhm.
And he tells a story of being in the Illinois Lunatic Asylum, as it was called in those days. It was a chilly building. He was wearing his hat. And as he was walking down a corridor, he saw a little man darting from a door and who said, "Excuse me, sir, I'm amazed that," and he's saying to Lincoln, "I'm amazed that you should presume to wear your hat in the presence of Christopher Columbus." Oh, says Lincoln, I beg your pardon, Mr. Columbus, and takes off his hat. Well, later in the morning, Lincoln had done his business and he's got his hat back on his head. And he once again meets this little man. He comes out and reproaches Lincoln by saying, "Sir, I am astounded. You should dare to wear your hat in the presence of General George Washington." Oh, excuse me, says Lincoln, taking off his hat, but it seems to me that less than an hour ago, you said you were Christopher Columbus. Oh, yes. Yeah, that is quite correct. But that was by another mother. You see
Yeah, yeah.
the story. So it's a, I mean, so or another one was where he said there's a guy who's the Illinois State Treasurer who's returning home drunk one night, and a lot of drunks in Lincoln stories. And he was in a cart that was being drawn by three fine red steers, and one of the cart's wheels got stuck in a post. Everyone sort of struck the post, and the jolt of the accident freed the steers, and they ran off. And they ran away, leaving Moore, the state treasurer, asleep. Well, in the morning, Moore wakes up and looks over the side of the cart and looks around in the woods and says, and this is the kind of lovely sort of fallacious logic. He says, "Well," he says, "if my name is John Moore, I've lost a pair of steers. But if my name ain't John Moore, I've found a cart." You get that. You
Yeah,
get
yeah.
this. You get it. So
I get
it's this kind of the thing I like about Lincoln is that because of he's got this kind of logical capacity, this very logical brain, he kind of just subverts it in some of these stories. But anyway, there we go. Those some of my favorite stories.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, great. Thank you so much for your time. I think you gave
Okay.
some really great insight, really valuable stories. I think definitely super
Well,
funny. Our viewers are gonna love listening to that. So really
yeah.
appreciate you taking the
Okay.
time. It's really an honor to speak to you.
Okay, Kathy. Very good. Well, all the best
Thank
with
you.
the rest of your project, and
Thank you so much.
yeah, let me know in the end how it goes.